April 2026. The port of Kiel on Germany's Baltic coast. A convoy of brand new main battle tanks, fresh from the factory floor, rolls up a loading ramp onto the ferry Color Fantasy, bound for Oslo. These are not upgraded veterans pulled from storage and modernized one more time the way nearly every new Leopard delivered for the past 3 decades had been. These are the first entirely new Leopard 2 hulls Germany has built from scratch since production of the original 2A4 ended in 1992, and they are heading to Norway before a single one reaches the German army that designed them. On paper, this tank is billed as the answer to everything the war raging just a few hundred kilometers to the east has taught Western militaries about modern armored combat, an equal parts firepower, protection, and digital connectivity package built specifically to survive a battlefield saturated with drones, loitering munitions, and precision-guided anti-tank missiles. And yet, almost from the moment its specifications became public, a growing chorus of defense analysts has been asking an uncomfortable question in print. Did Germany just spend billions of euros building an even heavier, even more expensive version of exactly the kind of tank the war in Ukraine has been quietly making obsolete? Its name is the Leopard 2A8, and unlike almost everything else this channel covers, its story is still being written in real time, with the argument over whether it actually works still very much unresolved. To understand why the Leopard 2A8 exists, you need to understand the shock that ran through the German defense establishment in the weeks after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Germany, along with several of its NATO partners, began donating older Leopard 2 tanks directly out of its own active fleet to Ukrainian forces, including a batch of Leopard 2A6 tanks handed over from the Bundeswehr's own limited stockpile. That decision made for entirely sound strategic reasons, exposed an uncomfortable fact that had been quietly ignored for years, that decades of post-Cold War defense cuts had left Germany's own tank fleet too small to comfortably absorb the loss of even a modest number of vehicles to an ally. The response was Zeitenwende, a roughly €100 billion rearmament program aimed at rebuilding German military capability essentially from the ground up, and the centerpiece of that program's armored component became a brand new tank rather than another incremental upgrade kit bolted onto existing 30-year-old hulls. Germany placed an initial order for 18 Leopard 2A8S in May 2023, specifically to replace the donated 2A6S, then expanded that order to 105 additional tanks in July 2024, bringing the total German commitment to 123 vehicles, with German officials publicly discussing plans for a further 75 on top of that as of late 2025. Norway signed on for 54, the Netherlands for 46, and Lithuania, Sweden, the Czech Republic, and Croatia each committed to roughly 44 apiece, with Croatia's order alone worth close to €2 billion. A negotiation with Italy's Leonardo collapsed in mid-2024 over how much of the manufacturing work Italian firms would actually be allowed to perform, sending Rome instead toward Rheinmetall's rival KF-51 Panther concept, a reminder that even among close allies building the same basic weapon, industrial politics can matter as much as battlefield requirements. The finished vehicle weighs approximately 70 tons in full combat configuration, making it not merely heavier than its already substantial 2A7 predecessor, but meaningfully heavier than almost any Western tank Germany has ever fielded. Power comes from the familiar MTU MB 873 K501 diesel engine producing around 1,500 horsepower, enough to push the vehicle to a top road speed in the range of 60 to 70 kilometers per hour, depending on the specific source and configuration, with an operational range of roughly 450 to 500 kilometers on internal fuel. The primary armament remains the Rheinmetall 120mm L55A1 smoothbore gun, a high-pressure evolution of the weapon that has anchored every Leopard 2 variant for years, capable of firing the latest DM-73 armor-piercing fin stabilized discarding sabot rounds alongside programmable DM-11 high-explosive shells whose detonation timing and effect can be adjusted on the fly, engaging targets out to roughly 4 or 5 kilometers under good conditions. Crew remains at 4, commander, gunner, loader, and driver, the same basic arrangement the Leopard 2 has used since its introduction in the late 1970s. What actually separates the 2A8 from every Leopard that came before it sits less in that familiar gun and engine combination and more in what German engineers built around them, a genuinely new hull and turret designed with modern manufacturing methods, rather than adapted from decades-old drawings, a fully digital electrical architecture built around NATO's generic vehicle architecture standard for sharing power and data across the vehicle, and, for the first time on any German tank, the Israeli-developed Trophy active protection system integrated directly into the turret design from the outset rather than retrofitted as an afterthought. Trophy, built by Israel's Rafael Advanced Defense Systems, works by using a set of radar arrays mounted around the turret to detect and track incoming anti-tank rockets and guided missiles, then firing a small explosively formed countermeasure to intercept and destroy the incoming threat meters before it reaches the tank's armor, creating what crews and engineers describe as a protective hemisphere around the vehicle. Unlike almost every other component discussed in this video, Trophy is not a theoretical capability waiting for its first real test. It has been in active combat service with the Israeli military since 2011, credited with intercepting numerous rocket-propelled grenades and guided anti-tank missiles in actual combat over more than a decade of use, making it one of the very few pieces of hardware on the entire Leopard 2A8 with a genuine, extensively documented battlefield record before it was ever bolted onto a German hull. That combat pedigree is precisely why German planners selected it over developing a comparable domestic system from scratch, prioritizing proven protection over the slower, riskier path of homegrown development at exactly the moment speed of fielding mattered most. If you are finding this deep dive into modern armored engineering and the ongoing debate over NATO's newest main battle tank useful, hit subscribe. It takes a second, costs nothing, and it helps the channel keep making this kind of content. The Leopard 2A8's rollout into actual service has been a story of international logistics as much as engineering. On April 28, 2026, Germany began delivering the first Leopard 2A8 NOR tanks to Norway, making Norway, rather than Germany's own army, the very first foreign operator to actually field the new variant, with a formal presentation held at Rena Camp 2 days later in front of Norwegian defense officials. That order, signed back in February 2023 and initially specified as an earlier configuration before requirements shifted toward the new 2A8 baseline, will see production split between assembly in Germany and final integration work performed domestically in Norway by the firm Retec at Levanger, with deliveries continuing on through 2028 and beyond. Lithuania has separately been designated to host Germany's first entire armored brigade, equipped with the 2A8 as part of a permanent forward deployment, reinforcing NATO's eastern flank, placing Germany's newest, most expensive tank directly along the alliance's most exposed border at almost exactly the moment critics were publishing their sharpest doubts about whether such a heavy, expensive platform actually belongs on that specific battlefield in the first place. That criticism has been pointed and specific, and it deserves to be taken seriously rather than dismissed as reflexive skepticism of anything new. Analysts examining the war in Ukraine have repeatedly observed that the single deadliest threat facing Western tanks there has turned out to be cheap first-person view drones and loitering munitions, weapons that cost a tiny fraction of the multi-million-dollar vehicle they are hunting and that frequently attack from directly above, precisely the angle traditional tank armor has always been thinnest, and hardest to reinforce without adding crippling extra weight. Critics of the 2A8 have pointed out, not unreasonably, that Germany's response to this specific, well-documented threat was to make the tank larger, heavier, and considerably more expensive rather than smaller, cheaper, and more numerous, doubling down on exactly the kind of exquisite, individually formidable but expensive to replace platform that a grinding war of attrition, the kind Ukraine has actually turned into, tends to punish severely. Trophy provides real protection against guided missiles and rocket-propelled grenades with an extensively proven combat record, but it was never designed to reliably intercept slower, cheaper, more numerous first-person view drones swarming from multiple directions at once and reinforced turret roof armor, however welcome, and has limits against a threat that can simply keep coming until something gets through. The point of comparison several defense commentators have drawn is to Russia's own T-90M, a considerably less sophisticated and less expensive tank that Russian industry has been able to triple production of specifically because its designers accepted a lower technical ceiling in exchange for a vehicle that could actually be replaced at the rate of prolonged war demands. Germany's counter-argument, made less through public statements and more through the sheer scale of the procurement itself, is that NATO's eastern flank is not fighting the same grinding, static, drone-saturated war of attrition currently underway in eastern Ukraine, and that a smaller, better protected, more networked force built around vehicles that can actually survive first contact and share targeting data across an entire NATO formation in real time represents a fundamentally different, and in Berlin's calculation, more appropriate bet for the specific deterrent mission the alliance actually needs along its most exposed borders. Whether that bet proves correct is not a question this video, or any video made today, can honestly answer, because unlike every other tank previously covered on this channel, the Leopard 2A8 has not yet fought a real war. Its trophy system has a genuine combat record from a different army in a different conflict. Its gun and engine are proven evolutions of decades old, extensively battle-tested designs. But the tank as a complete, integrated platform, the specific combination of weight, armor, digital architecture, and active protection that German engineers bet an entire modernization program on, remains, as of this recording, untested in the one environment that has ever actually settled arguments like this one. Beyond trophy, the Leopard 2A8's passive protection package reflects the same lessons drawn directly from Ukraine, where artillery, mines, and drone-delivered explosives rather than direct tank-on-tank gunnery have accounted for the overwhelming majority of destroyed vehicles on both sides. The tank's turret roof has been reinforced specifically against top attack munitions, its underside strengthened against mine and improvised explosive blasts, and it carries a full nuclear, biological, and chemical protection system to keep its four-man crew operational in contaminated environments. A capability that sounds almost old-fashioned next to discussions of drone swarms and network targeting, but that remains a hard requirement for any NATO vehicle expected to operate across the alliance's full range of contingency plans. Every one of these additions costs weight, and weight is precisely the resource German engineers had the least room to spend freely, given that the 2A8 was already growing heavier than its predecessor before a single extra millimeter of anti-drone protection was added. A tension between survivability and mobility that has no clean engineering solution. Only trade-offs that different armies are choosing to make differently based on how each one expects its own next war to actually unfold. The broader significance of the Leopard 2A8 program extends beyond the individual vehicle and into the industrial base that will need to sustain it for decades. Germany's Zeitenwende commitment envisions ordering as many as 1,000 additional main battle tanks over the coming years, a mix that will likely include continued 2A8 production alongside an intermediate upgrade path, sometimes referred to as the Leopard 2AX or Leopard 3, before an eventual transition to the jointly developed Franco-German main ground combat system intended to replace the Leopard 2 family entirely sometime in the 2030s. That timeline means the 2A8, whatever the final verdict on its individual design trade-offs turns out to be, is likely to remain the backbone of German and Allied armored forces for a full generation, exactly the kind of long service horizon that makes getting the underlying philosophy right, mass versus sophistication, passive armor versus active protection, individual platform survivability versus battlefield network integration, matter far more than any single specification sheet number ever could on its own. Return to the port of Kiel, April 2026. A convoy of the newest, most heavily protected, most thoroughly networked tanks Germany has ever built rolls onto a ferry bound for Norway, the first entirely clean sheet Leopard design in over 3 decades, built specifically in response to a war being fought less than 1,000 kilometers from where it was manufactured. Every criticism leveled against it is documented, specific, and on its own terms entirely fair. It is heavier than its own predecessor at the exact moment critics argue tanks need to become lighter. It is more expensive at the exact moment a war of attrition next door is demonstrating the value of cheap, replaceable mass. Its additional armor addresses threats that were already well understood while offering no complete answer to the swarming drone threat that has actually been killing the most tanks in the nearest real war. And yet its active protection system carries more than a decade of genuine combat proven reliability from a different battlefield entirely. Its gun and mobility inherit 40 years of continuous refinement. And its digital architecture represents a real measurable leap in how a modern tank shares information with everything else on the battlefield around it. Unlike the Panther rushed into Kursk, unlike the Sherman that absorbed Normandy's hedgerows, unlike the King Tiger that ran out of fuel at La Gleize, the Leopard 2A8 has not yet had its Barkman's corner or its Recourt, the single battlefield moment that either vindicates or exposes every engineering decision that went into it. That moment, if it ever comes, has not happened yet. What has happened is a bet, placed by an entire nation rebuilding its military from a standing start, that the next war on European soil will still have room for a tank this heavy, this expensive, and this thoroughly protected. History has not rendered its verdict. For now, the argument is still the whole story.